The message arrived at 3:14 in the morning, Earth Standard Time. I was not asleep. Nobody in the building was asleep. We had been awake for 11 days straight, rotating in shifts, running on bitter coffee, and whatever food the kitchen staff kept bringing up on carts. The United Nations Diplomatic Relay Center, buried 6 floors below New York City, smelled like recycled air and old paper and the quiet fear of people who understood exactly what was happening and could not say it out loud. My name is Calvin Osei. I am, or was at the time, a commander-level liaison officer attached to the UN's Office of Interstellar Communications. My job, on paper, was to translate, not languages. The translation algorithms handled that easily enough by the time I joined the department. My job was to translate intent, to read the space between words, to look at a transmission from a species that had 17 tonal registers and a completely different concept of time, and tell the Secretary General what they actually meant. On the night the Vorthari Dominion delivered their ultimatum to Earth, I read the message 3 times. Then I sat down in my chair, folded my hands on the desk, and said nothing for almost 2 minutes. My colleague, a woman named Laura Finch, who had been with the department longer than anyone and had the quiet steadiness of someone who had survived several near crises, leaned over from the station beside mine. "Well," she said. "They're serious," I said. "They are completely, genuinely serious." She already knew that. She was asking me to say it out loud, because saying things out loud made them real, and real things could be addressed. The message itself was short. The Vorthari were not a species that used unnecessary words. Their communication style was blunt to the point of being almost mechanical, and their diplomatic tradition, such as it was, consisted of one party stating its demands and the other party choosing between compliance and consequences. They had used this method 47 times across 47 civilizations, and 47 times the other party had chosen compliance. The message said the following: "The Vorthari Dominion addresses the species known as humans, inhabitants of the 3rd planet in the Sol system. You have expanded into 6 colony territories that fall within the Dominion's designated sphere of influence. These territories must be vacated and surrendered to Dominion authority within 30 standard cycles. Failure to comply will result in the full application of Dominion force against your inhabited worlds, beginning with your primary population center. This is the only communication you will receive on this matter. There is no negotiation. There is no appeal. 30 standard cycles translated to roughly 22 Earth days." I printed the message. I walked it up to the 6th floor. I handed it to Secretary General Diane Kowalski, who read it standing at her desk, still in the coat she had worn in from the car. She read it once, set it down, poured herself a glass of water, and drank the whole glass before she spoke. "Get me the Security Council," she said. "All of them. Right now." The next 4 hours were the loudest I had ever experienced inside a government building. I stood at the edge of the room and watched 17 of the most powerful people on Earth argue at a volume that suggested they had forgotten other people could hear them. The positions split almost immediately, and they split in a way I had expected. One group believed we should begin negotiations immediately, reach out to the Vorthari, signal a willingness to find a middle ground, perhaps offer reduced presence in some of the disputed territories while retaining others. This group pointed to the 47 civilizations that had survived by complying. They pointed to the fact that we had no military technology that could match what the Dominion had demonstrated against those 47 worlds. The other group said nothing for quite a long time. Then Admiral Grace Tillman, who commanded Earth's Combined Orbital Defense Network, stood up and said, in a voice so flat and calm it stopped every other conversation in the room, "We need to understand something first. Does the Vorthari Dominion have a history of honoring agreements made under threat?" The room went quiet. I answered, because it was my job to answer. "No," I said. "In 4 of the 47 cases, the species that complied were subsequently subjected to additional demands within 2 to 3 standard years. In all 4 cases, full absorption into the Dominion followed within a decade." Tillman nodded once, as if I had confirmed something she already knew. She sat back down without saying anything further. The Galactic Council, the loose coalition of species that managed what passed for interstellar governance, had been watching this unfold since the moment the Vorthari transmitted. Their response came through on our secondary relay channel about an hour into the Security Council session. It came from Ambassador Veth of the Solari, one of the oldest and most respected species in the Council, a being who communicated through a combination of color shifts and subsonic tones that our equipment translated into a slow, careful voice. The Council urges the human government to respond promptly to the Dominion's terms. The Vorthari have honored surrender agreements in 43 of the documented cases. We understand this is difficult. We wish to express our genuine sympathy. However, the Council has no mechanism by which we could intervene militarily, and we would not survive such an attempt even if we tried. Please, do not mistake our honesty for indifference. We are telling you the truth because we believe you deserve it. I translated this for the Secretary General personally. She listened, nodded, and then asked me a question that I have thought about many times since. Calvin, she said, when you read the Vorthari message, what was the first thing you felt? I thought about it honestly. Irritation, I said. She looked at me. Not fear, I said. Irritation, like someone had just told me I had to give up something I worked for, because they said so, and they were bigger than me. That's the first thing I felt. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, write that down somewhere. I have a feeling it's going to matter. I went back downstairs. The building hummed around me. 6 floors of the most sophisticated communication technology on the planet, staffed by people who had spent their careers preparing for exactly this kind of moment, and all of us were awake at 4 in the morning doing the very unglamorous work of sitting and waiting and thinking. Laura Finch was at her station, tracking the galactic feeds. The Vorthari ultimatum had been broadcast on open channels, which meant every species in the Council had heard it at the same moment we had. The response from the galactic community was coming in waves. Most of it was sympathetic. Some of it was the specific kind of sympathetic that people use when they believe nothing can be done, and they want to make sure you know they feel bad about it. One feed, from a small observational post run by a species called the Denhari, who were known for their extremely precise record-keeping, simply noted the time, the content of the ultimatum, and the following observation. Sol system species have not yet responded. This is unusual. Average response time from species receiving first ultimatum is 4.2 hours. Current elapsed time, 9.7 hours. Laura had highlighted that one. She tapped it when I sat down. They're already watching the clock, she said. Let them watch, I said. She looked at me with an expression that was somewhere between curious and careful. You're not scared, she said. It was not quite a question. I didn't say that, I said. But you're not. I looked at the ceiling for a moment. My grandfather told me a story once, I said, about a time when he was young, in a city that was having very bad problems, and a group of men came to his neighborhood and told everyone there that they had to leave or face consequences. And he said the neighborhood did something those men did not expect. What did they do? Laura asked. They stayed, I said. They organized, they stayed, and they made it clear that the cost of removing them was going to be much higher than anyone was willing to pay. And the men left. Laura was quiet for a while. The Vorthari have 47 civilizations worth of experience, telling them that threats work, I said. They do, she agreed. They don't have any experience with us. Outside the building, the city moved the way it always moved, indifferent and enormous. The feeds kept coming in. The clock kept running. Somewhere in the building above us, a Secretary General was deciding what humanity was going to say back to the stars. I refilled my coffee, sat down, and waited. Whatever she decided, I had a feeling the galaxy was not ready for it. It took Diane Kowalski 18 days. 18 days of closed sessions, open arguments, expert consultations, military briefings, and very long silences. 18 days during which the Galactic Council sent 11 separate requests urging humanity to respond, 6 of which included increasingly urgent warnings about what the Vorthari were capable of. 18 days during which every news outlet on Earth ran continuous coverage that ranged from calm analytical reporting to pure panic, depending on the channel and the hour. I was present for most of those 18 days, not in every room, not for every conversation, but close enough to watch the shape of it. I watched the arguments cycle through the same positions again and again. I watched the military side run projections and come back with numbers that were not encouraging. I watched diplomats who had spent their entire careers finding compromise stare at a situation where the other party had explicitly stated there was no compromise available. And I watched Kowalski. She was not a dramatic person. She had gotten to her position by being extremely good at listening, which sounds simple until you watch someone do it at her level. She listened to the argument for compliance. She listened to the argument against it. She listened to the military projections. She listened to the historical analysis of what had happened to the 47 civilizations. She listened to Admiral Tillman, who was not a talker but who, when she did speak, said exactly what she meant, and nothing extra. On the morning of the 18th day, Kowalski called me into her office. Just me. She was sitting behind her desk with a cup of tea that had gone cold, and she had a single sheet of paper in front of her, with about 3 sentences written on it. "I want you to read this," she said, "and tell me if the meaning comes through." I read it. Then I read it again. "It comes through," I said. "Good." She picked up the paper. "I want it transmitted on the open galactic relay. All channels. I want every species in the Council to receive it simultaneously, and I want the Vorthari to receive it first." "Understood," I said. "When?" "Now," she said. I walked downstairs carrying that piece of paper as carefully as if it were something that could break. Laura was at her station. 2 other operators were at theirs. I handed the paper to the transmission team personally, stood while they prepared the signal, and watched as one of the most consequential messages in human history went out into the dark. The message said the following: "The people of Earth have received the communication from the Vorthari Dominion. We have considered it fully and without haste. Our response is this: we do not surrender territory under threat. We do not negotiate with those who use harm against others as a starting position. We do not recognize the Dominion's authority over territories settled by human citizens." This channel is now closed. That was it. No flourish, no additional explanation, no expression of regret, or sympathy, or desire for a different outcome. 3 short paragraphs delivered in the same flat, direct register that the Vorthari themselves used. The transmission took approximately 14 seconds to send. What happened afterward took considerably longer to process. The first response came from the Vorthari themselves, 11 minutes after our transmission reached them. It was a single line, and even through the translation algorithm, the tone carried something I can only describe as disbelief. It said, "You have misunderstood the nature of this communication. This was not an invitation to debate." Kowalski, who had come down to the relay center to watch the feeds, read that response on my screen. She said, very quietly, "We understood perfectly." She did not transmit a reply. She had said the channel was closed, and she meant it. The second wave of responses came from the Galactic Council, and here is where things became genuinely extraordinary to watch. Ambassador Veth of the Solari transmitted a message that began with 17 seconds of silence, which in Solari communication is the equivalent of someone standing completely still because they cannot decide what to do with their hands. Then Veth said, "We are uncertain how to categorize this response. In the 47 documented cases, the species receiving a Vorthari ultimatum has never responded in this way. We are consulting our records." The Denhari observation post sent a purely factual update. Human species has formally declined the Vorthari ultimatum. This is the first recorded instance of such a declination, updating the historical record accordingly. The Krithani, a species known for being blunt even by galactic standards, sent a transmission that consisted entirely of the following: "Do you understand what you have done? Do you require assistance evacuating your population?" Laura read that one aloud and then looked at me. "They think we made a mistake. They think we panicked," I said. "They think we sent the wrong message by accident, or we don't understand the stakes." "Do we understand the stakes?" "Yes," I said. "That's the part they don't understand yet." What followed over the next 3 days was something I started thinking of privately as the great explanation failure, because every species in the Council tried in some way to explain to us what we had done, as if we had not meant to do it. The Solari sent 3 separate transmissions urging us to issue a correction. The Fenori, a species that had themselves complied with the Vorthari a generation ago and had been absorbed into the Dominion's outer territories, sent a message that was genuinely difficult to read, because it was written by someone who clearly remembered what that experience was like, and was trying very hard to protect us from it. They do not stop, the Fenori message said. Once you refuse, they escalate. They always escalate. Please reconsider while there is still time. I translated that one for Kowalski personally. She read it twice. Her face was not expressionless. She felt the weight of it, I could see that. She was not someone who treated these things as abstract. Send them our thanks, she said, and tell them we received their message, and we are aware of what we are doing. Should I say anything else? I asked. She thought for a moment. Tell them we remember what they went through. Tell them we are sorry it happened, and tell them we are not going to let it happen to us. I sent that message. The Fenori did not reply for 2 days. When they did, it was very short. It said, "We hope you are right. We do not believe you can win, but we hope you are right." The internal reaction on Earth was, to put it mildly, not simple. There were protests. There were people who were genuinely frightened, which was completely understandable. There were experts on every kind of media explaining why this was either the most courageous or the most reckless decision in human history, and many of them managed to make both arguments sound equally convincing. There were also, and I want to be honest about this because it matters, a very large number of people who read Kowalski's message and felt something that was not fear at all. My mother called me from Accra 3 hours after the transmission went public. She is not a person who discusses politics or interstellar affairs. She grows vegetables and reads history books and makes a specific kind of soup that I have been trying to replicate my entire adult life without success. She called me, and she said, "Calvin, I saw what the Secretary General said." "Yes," I said. "Good," Hata, she said, and then she hung up. That, I decided, was going to be very hard to explain to the Galactic Council. Inside the relay center, the feeds kept coming. The Vorthari went quiet for 4 days after our response, which was itself unusual. In the 47 cases, they had issued their initial ultimatum and then followed it within 48 hours with a second communication, either confirming the demands or announcing the beginning of enforcement. 4 days of silence was something the Denhari had never recorded. During those 4 days, something else was happening that I did not know about at the time, but learned afterward. Earth's defense coordination teams were not sitting quietly. They had been working since day one on contingency plans, not because anyone believed we were definitely going to fight, but because the specific kind of people who staff those departments are constitutionally incapable of not preparing for the worst possible outcome, which is, in situations like that one, exactly the quality you want them to have. Admiral Tillman later described those 4 days as the most productive of her career. She did not mean that in a way that sounded like she was looking forward to anything. She meant it the way a surgeon means it when they say a very complicated procedure went exactly as planned. On the 5th day after our transmission, the Vorthari responded. They did not send a message this time. They sent a broadcast. Open channel, all frequencies, directed at the entire Galactic Council, as well as Earth. It was longer than anything they had sent before, and its tone had shifted in a way that even the translation algorithm flagged as significant. There was something in it that read, in every version across 17 different translation programs, as something very close to anger. The Vorthari Dominion has received the response of the Sol System species. This response will be treated as a formal rejection of the Dominion's terms. We wish to make the following clear to all observing species. The humans have chosen this path without understanding where it leads. The Dominion has never failed to enforce its terms. This is not arrogance. This is history. We have given the humans an opportunity that no species in the Dominion's history has ever wasted. They have wasted it. Whatever follows is the result of their choice, not ours. The council chamber, as described to me later by Ambassador Veth, went completely silent when that transmission finished. Then one of the younger council members, a Solari representative named Os, who had been observing proceedings without speaking, transmitted a short message to our relay directly. It was not an official council communication. It was personal. Os said, "I have studied your history. I have been studying it since your first response. I want to ask you a question, not as a council member but as someone who is trying to understand. Do your people genuinely not experience fear the way other species do? Or do you experience it and simply choose to continue anyway?" I wrote back to Os personally. I said, "We experience it, We just have a lot of practice deciding it is not the most important thing in the room." There was a pause of about 6 hours. Then Os replied, "I think I am beginning to understand. I am not sure whether that is reassuring or more frightening." "Honestly," I told them, "it depends entirely on which side you are on." Laura was standing behind me when I sent that. She read it over my shoulder and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "You know, when I was about 9 years old, there was a kid in my neighborhood who used to bother everyone. Big kid, loud, always made everyone give up their spot on the playground." "What happened?" I asked. "One day a smaller kid just said no," she said. "Just flat out no. And the big kid didn't know what to do with that. He'd never had a no before. He stood there for about 30 seconds, and then walked away." She paused. "Of course. The next day he came back with 2 friends," she said. "Did the smaller kid back down?" Laura smiled. It was the specific kind of smile that people give when they already know the end of the story. "No," she said. "And eventually the big kid found somewhere else to be." I turned back to my screen. The feeds were running. The council was debating. The Vorthari were preparing something. And somewhere outside this building, a planet of 8 billion people was reading the news, arguing with their families, and going about the complicated business of being human. We had said no. The galaxy was about to find out what that word cost to deliver. The leak happened on a Tuesday, which felt appropriate somehow. I was at my station in the relay center when Laura put a hand on my shoulder and silently pointed at the secondary feed on her monitor. Someone, and it was never officially confirmed who, had uploaded a compressed archive to the Galactic Open Network. The archive contained documents. Specifically, it contained a collection of internal Earth defense strategy papers, planning documents, and military operational philosophies that, under normal circumstances, would have required about 11 levels of clearance to access. The person or persons who released it clearly believed they were doing something clever. The thinking, as best anyone could reconstruct it afterward, was that exposing humanity's defense framework would reveal weaknesses, cause panic, undermine public confidence, and possibly push Earth's leadership toward reconsidering its position. Show everyone exactly what we had and what we lacked, and the math would do the rest. It did not go the way they planned. Within 40 minutes of the archive going public, the Galactic Council's analysis teams had begun working through it. By the end of the first hour, several Council species had transmitted requests to their own research departments, asking for help with certain translated terms that they did not have context for. By the end of the second hour, Ambassador Veth sent a private message to our relay center that contained no actual words. It was just a Solari silence pattern, 17 seconds long, which my algorithm tagged with the annotation, "Emotional state unclassifiable with current parameters." I downloaded the archive myself. I had clearance for some of it and not others. But in the chaos of the day, nobody was checking, and I read through as much as I could. I understood almost immediately why the rest of the galaxy was struggling with it. The documents were not what the people who released them thought they were. They were not a list of weaknesses or gaps or under-equipped units. They were something much harder to process if you had not grown up on Earth and spent your entire life surrounded by human history. The first document that seemed to stop everyone cold was one titled, in the translation that eventually circulated, "Contingency Framework for Continuity of Species Function under Conditions of Maximum Sustained Pressure." What it described, in language that was extremely calm and very detailed, was a planning philosophy built on a core assumption that no external threat would ever be large enough to justify surrender if surrender itself meant eventual elimination. It laid out, in clear terms, the reasoning. If the cost of resistance is high but the cost of compliance ultimately leads to the same end, then the logical choice is resistance, because resistance at least preserves the possibility of a different outcome. This was, apparently, not how most species thought. Ambassador Veth's follow-up message arrived about 4 hours after the archive went public. This one had words. "We have reviewed the planning documents now circulating on the public network. We wish to ask several clarifying questions, and we wish to be respectful in how we ask them. The documents reference a concept that our translation team is rendering as disproportionate response strategy. Can you confirm that this is an accurate rendering of the intent? And if so, Can you explain the reasoning behind a doctrine that specifically plans to respond to any aggressive act with a level of force that exceeds the initial act? I drafted the response to that one personally, and walked it up to Kowalski for approval before we sent it. She read it, changed 2 words, and nodded. We sent back the following. Yes, the translation is accurate. The reasoning is this. A proportional response tells the aggressor that aggression, at a certain level, produces a specific and manageable cost. It allows them to calculate whether the gain is worth the cost, and to continue if they decide it is. A disproportionate response removes that calculation. It tells the aggressor that the cost of the initial act is unknown, potentially unlimited, and not worth discovering through continued action. The purpose is not punishment. The purpose is clarity. There was a very long pause after that. While we waited, I watched the galactic feeds fill up with analysis. Species across the Council were reading the leaked documents and having very different reactions depending on their own history and diplomatic culture. The Solari, who had a tradition of formal mediated resolution, seemed genuinely confused by the underlying logic. The Krathani, who had a more martial history, went quieter than they had been, which was its own kind of signal. The Fenori, who had been absorbed by the Vorthari 2 generations ago, sent a message that was only 3 lines long, but which I read several times because of what was in it. The Fenori message said, "We are reading these documents. We wish we had read them before we complied with the Dominion. We did not know this kind of thinking existed. We thought the only choices were compliance or end. We did not understand there was a third choice." I showed that one to Laura. She read it and was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's the saddest thing I've read all week." "Yes," I said, "and the most important." But it was not the strategic documents that caused the most disruption in the galactic feeds. It was the historical ones. Someone on one of the Council research teams, cross-referencing the defense documents for context, had pulled Earth's public historical record, not selected pieces of it, all of it, or as much as could be accessed through publicly available archives. And they had begun, in real time, sharing what they were finding with their colleagues across several species, who shared it further, and within about 12 hours of the archive leak, a significant portion of the Galactic Council's analytical community was deep in 10,000 years of human history and making the specific face, or whatever physical equivalent their species had, that people make when they realize they have fundamentally misunderstood something. The Denhari, true to form, published a summary. It was factual, completely without editorializing, and somehow more disturbing for it. Species Summary Update. Sol System Humans. The species has engaged in large-scale organized conflict with other members of its own species continuously throughout recorded history. These conflicts have ranged from regional to global in scale. The species has developed weapons capable of ending all complex life on its home planet, and has chosen not to use them in conflicts following that development, demonstrating that restraint and capability coexist in their strategic culture. The species has rebuilt its own civilizational infrastructure multiple times following catastrophic events, and has continued expanding. The species appears to treat existential threat as a familiar condition rather than an exceptional one. Ambassador Veth sent another private message after that summary circulated. It said, "I have been in Council service for 41 standard years. I have studied 63 species. I have never encountered a historical record like yours. I want to ask you something directly, and I want you to answer honestly. Has your species ever, in your recorded history, faced a threat you believed was entirely unwinnable, and fought anyway?" I knew the answer without needing to look it up. "Many times," I replied. "More than we can count. Some of those times, we were right to think it was unwinnable, and we lost. But even then, we usually made the cost high enough that whoever won thought hard before doing it again." The response from Veth was a long time coming. When it arrived, it said only, "I think I understand now why you said no. I do not know if I believe you can survive what comes next, but I understand why you said it." The Vorthari reacted to the leaked documents differently from the Council. They sent one transmission, addressed only to Earth, not broadcast on open channels. It came through our primary relay at around midnight, Earth Standard Time, and I was the first one in the building to read it. "You have shown the galaxy your plans. You believe this makes you appear strong. The Dominion has processed your documents. Our analysis is as follows. Your weapons programs are capable but not superior to ours. Your strategic doctrine assumes a resilience in your population that has not been tested by external force at civilizational scale. Your confidence is based on a history of conflicts with members of your own species, who share your psychology and your pain tolerance. We are not members of your species. The variables that have historically allowed you to succeed against each other do not apply to us. You are welcome to believe otherwise. You will not believe it for long. I read that message 4 times. Then I made a printed copy and went upstairs to Kowalski's office. It was late, but her light was on. I slid the message across her desk without saying anything. She read it once. Then she read it again. Then she said something that I wrote down and have kept ever since because it is, I think, one of the most accurate things I have ever heard a human being say. They think our history is a record of what we can survive, she said. They're reading it as a list of our limits. They don't understand it's a list of how far we'll go. She handed the message back to me. No reply, she said. We've already said everything we need to say. I went back downstairs. The feeds were running. The galaxy was watching, and somewhere, a species that had never lost a confrontation in 47 attempts was preparing to discover something the Galactic Council was only beginning to suspect. That the thing that makes humans hard to reason with is not that we don't understand danger. It's that we do, and we continue anyway. On the 41st day since the Vorthari ultimatum, a small colony on the edge of the Kepler belt woke up to ships in the sky. The colony was called Faro Station. About 12,000 people lived there. It had been a mining settlement originally, built around a set of mineral deposits that made the location economically worth the cost of establishment. By the time of the events I am describing, it had grown into something more than that, the way human settlements always do. There was a school. There were 3 community centers. There was a garden district that the original settlers had started and that the second generation had expanded, because human beings, even in remote locations on the edge of known space, will find a way to grow things. The colony had a small defense force, not small in the sense of undertrained or undedicated, small in the sense that 12,000 people on a mining colony do not require the same scale of military presence as a major planetary installation. They had patrol craft, early warning systems, communication relays directly connected to Earth's Defense Command, and a garrison of 41 soldiers, whose job was primarily to keep order and respond to emergencies. 41 soldiers. Against what came out of the dark that morning, 41 soldiers was not a number that was going to change the outcome of the fight, and the garrison commander, a steady-voiced woman named Frances Doyle, knew that from the moment the first signal hit the early warning array. She did not panic. The communication logs show that clearly. She opened a channel to Earth Defense Command within 11 seconds of the first alert. She stated what she was seeing in a calm and organized way. She made sure every civilian in the colony had received the evacuation signal. And then she held the garrison in position because her orders said to hold. And she was the kind of person who followed her orders, even when the math was not in her favor. I was in the relay center when the signal from Faro Station came through. It came in on the defense band, not the diplomatic channels I normally monitored, but the 2 systems shared a monitoring wall, and when the alert tone sounded, every head in the room turned at once. I listened to Frances Doyle's voice on that channel. I want to be honest. There are things about those hours that I do not feel comfortable describing in detail, because the people of Faro Station were real, and what happened to them was real, and it deserves to be described with the weight it actually carried, not dressed up in the language of a story. I will say that the garrison held for 6 hours. I will say that the civilian evacuation was largely successful. I will say that Frances Doyle was still transmitting when her channel went quiet, and that the last thing she said, addressed to Earth Defense Command, was that she hoped we remembered what this was for. We did. We do. What I want to describe, because it is the part of those hours that is hardest to explain to people who were not there, is what happened in the relay center after the channel went quiet. Nobody spoke for about 90 seconds. Then Admiral Tillman's voice came through on the command band, and she said 4 words to her operational team. Execute Contingency 7. Now. I had not known, until that moment, what Contingency 7 was. I had clearance for the leaked documents, but not for the operational plans that sat beneath them. What I learned in the hours that followed was that Contingency 7 was not a plan for defending against the strike on Faro Station. That strike was already done. Contingency 7 was a plan that had been developed over 41 days of preparation, during which Earth's defense coordination teams had done what they always did when given a problem and enough time. They had worked the problem completely, from every possible angle, and they had built something specific. The Galactic Council found out about it the same way everyone else did, which is to say they found out because it happened. 72 hours after the strike on Faro Station, Earth's response began. Not at Faro Station. The Vorthari were already gone from there. Earth's response began at every catalogued Vorthari military installation in the quadrant, simultaneously, within a window of execution that the Denhari later calculated at approximately 4 minutes and 17 seconds from first strike to last. The Council observation posts that were in range to capture what happened described it afterward in their own ways. The Solari observers used a phrase that translated roughly as, "a force applied without hesitation, in all directions at once." The Krathani, who had the most militarily experienced analysts of any species watching, sent a message that was 2 words long. It said, "Structured overwhelming." I was watching the Council feeds when those descriptions came in. I was also watching the internal defense command channels, where the reports were coming in with a kind of regularity that felt almost strange. Each installation confirmed, each operation concluded, each piece of the plan executing in the order it had been designed. Laura was beside me. She had been in the building for the full 72 hours since Faro Station. Most of us had. Nobody had wanted to leave. "It's working," she said quietly, watching the feeds. "Yes," I said. "They didn't expect this," she said. "No," I said. "They expected us to be fighting back at Faro Station. They expected us to be reactive and local. They planned their defense around a response that targets where they hit us, not where they are." She was quiet for a moment. "They modeled our response based on their own strategy." "Yes, that was the mistake. That was the mistake," I agreed. The Galactic Council's response to what was happening was unprecedented, in the sense that the Council itself was not structured to have a response to something it had never conceived of. They had a process for mediating disputes. They had a process for issuing warnings. They had a process for documenting conflicts. They did not have a process for watching the species they had been trying to convince to surrender, turn around and execute a precision multi-site operation that was, by any military standard, extraordinary. Ambassador Veth's message arrived during the 2nd hour of operations. It was not a council message. It was again, personal. Veth said, "I am watching the operational feeds from our observers. I do not have the military background to evaluate what I am seeing in technical terms. But I have been in this work long enough to recognize the difference between a species that is reacting and a species that was ready. You were ready. You have been ready since before Faro Station. I think I need to understand something. Did you expect them to strike the colony?" I wrote back personally, because it was that kind of message. I said, "We didn't know where. We didn't know when. We knew that they would, because that is what the history said they would do. So we prepared for after, while they were preparing to strike. They spent those 41 days deciding where to hit us. We spent them deciding what we would do when they did." There was a very long pause. Then Veth said, "You let them choose the first move, so you could control everything that came after." I did not reply to that one right away, because I was not sure how to explain, in terms that would translate cleanly, that it was not quite that calculated, and not quite that cold, that it was simply what humans do when they are given a problem, and a fixed amount of time, and a set of constraints they cannot change. They work the problem, they prepare, they hold the line on the things that matter, and they wait for the moment when what they have built can actually be used. Frances Doyle held her garrison at Faro Station for 6 hours, because she was buying that moment for everyone who came after. I wrote back to Veth much later, after the operational phase was complete and things had quieted enough to think clearly. I said, "We did not see Faro Station as a sacrifice. We saw it as a reason. There is a difference. A sacrifice is something you choose to give up. A reason is something that makes every choice that follows it completely clear. We did not need the Council's permission to respond. We did not need a legal framework, or a vote, or a mediator. We needed to know who we were fighting for. Veth responded with 17 seconds of silence, and then said, I am going to record this conversation in the council archive. I want people to be able to read it in 100 years and understand what happened here. I told Veth that was fine with me. The operational phase lasted 19 hours from start to finish. By the end of it, the Vorthari Dominion's military infrastructure in the quadrant had been reduced to a fraction of its previous capacity. Their forward command was unable to coordinate, and their ability to mount a follow-up operation against any human territory was, according to the military assessments being finalized around me, extremely limited. Admiral Tillman appeared in the relay center briefly at the end of hour 17. She was not the kind of person who made speeches. She stood at the front of the room, looked at the feeds, looked at the staff, and said, Good work. Go get some sleep when you can. Then she left. I stayed at my station because there was more to do, more feeds to monitor, more transmissions coming in from the council and from other species who were processing what they had just watched. But in a quiet moment, when the feeds briefly slowed, I thought about Frances Doyle and the 12,000 people of Faro Station and what she had said in her last transmission, that she hoped we remembered what this was for. We did. Every person in that building did. Every person in the Defense Command did. That is the thing about humans that is hardest to explain to a species that has never had to learn it the way we have. We do not fight well because we are made for it. We fight well because we remember why we started. The war ended on a morning that felt like any other morning if you were not paying attention to the right things. I was at my station. Laura was beside me. The coffee was bad, as it always was. The feeds were running. And at 7:42 in the morning, Earth Standard Time, a transmission arrived from the Vorthari Dominion on the primary diplomatic channel that had been officially closed since Kowalski's first response, 39 days earlier. It was not a threat. It was not a statement of position. It was a request for communication. That was the Vorthari way of saying they wanted to talk. I flagged it immediately and walked it upstairs in person, because some things you do not send through an internal channel. Kowalski read the transmission at her desk, with a cup of coffee that was actually hot for once, and she was quiet for a long time afterward. How long between their last recorded loss and this? She asked. They have no recorded losses, I said. 47 confrontations, 47 compliances. This is the first time they've ever reached this point. She nodded slowly. Then they don't know how to do this, she said. No, I said. They've never had to. Good, she said. That means we set the terms. The negotiations, if you could call them that, took 11 days. They were conducted through a dedicated channel with Galactic Council observers present, because Kowalski had decided that transparency was the appropriate approach, given that the Council had been watching everything anyway, and might as well do it officially. Ambassador Veth led the observer team and documented everything with the meticulous care the Solari were known for. Earth's terms were, by the standards of any conflict in human history, restrained. No territorial expansion beyond what we already held. No reparations beyond the specific costs of rebuilding Faro Station. A formal recognition of humanity's right to its existing colonies. And a binding agreement, registered with the Council, that the Vorthari Dominion would not use threat, force, or coercion against any Earth territory, or Earth-affiliated settlement. The Vorthari accepted every term. I watched the final confirmation come through. I had been awake for a very long time by that point, and everything had that slightly unreal quality that comes with exhaustion and very large events. Laura was beside me. Several other members of the relay team who had been with us through the whole thing were standing at various points around the room, watching the feeds. When the confirmation came through, nobody cheered. I want to be clear about that, because it would have been easy to cheer, and some of the galactic observers apparently expected us to, and were puzzled when we didn't. There was a long, quiet exhale in the room. Laura put her hand on my arm briefly, and then took it away. Someone at the back of the room said something very softly to the person next to them. Kowalski, who was watching from the secondary monitor at the communications desk, looked at the confirmation for a long moment and then said, to no one in particular, Faro Station reconstruction teams are ready to go? Her chief of staff said, ready to deploy on your word. Send them, she said. That was the end of the war. What came after it was almost as strange as the war itself, in completely different ways. The Galactic Council convened a formal session 3 days after the Vorthari agreement was signed. I watched the feed from the relay center, and it was the first time I had watched a council session feeling something other than tension. They debated for 6 hours. The debate covered several topics that would have been remarkable to observe under any circumstances, but the one that I want to describe, because it mattered the most in the long run, was the discussion about how to update the galactic navigation and diplomatic record. The galactic record, for context, was a shared database that all council species contributed to and all council species used. It contained species profiles, diplomatic histories, territorial maps, interaction guidelines, and what were called engagement advisories, which were essentially diplomatic warnings about how to approach a given species, what they valued, what they found offensive, and how contact was best initiated. The Council had never, in its history, added an engagement advisory for a species that read the way the one for humanity did. The full text was released on the public network, and I read it sitting at my station with a cup of coffee while the feeds ran around me. It said the following: Species classification, human, origin, Sol system, third planet, diplomatic status, fully sovereign, non-allied, independent signatories to the Council's core charter, communication style, direct, decision-making structure, representational, with strong institutional support for defensive posture, engagement advisory. This species does not respond to threats in the pattern observed in other Council member species. Threats are processed not as deterrence but as information about the threatening party's intentions. Escalation in response to human non-compliance with demands is unlikely to produce the desired outcome and is strongly likely to produce an outcome significantly worse than the initiating party intended. This species has a documented history of extended conflict at civilizational scale, including internal conflicts, and maintains robust planning frameworks for all threat scenarios. Recommended approach: honest communication, clear mutual benefit, and respect for established sovereignty. Do not attempt coercive contact. Do not deliver ultimatums. Do not assume that a lack of immediate response indicates uncertainty or weakness. It indicates that they are thinking carefully, and that what follows will be thorough. Laura read it over my shoulder. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Well, that's one way to get your reputation established." "We've had worse introductions," I said. "True." She refilled her coffee and went back to her station. I sat with it for a little longer. A galactic warning. About us. Posted in the shared record that every species in the known galaxy would consult before they ever reached out to Earth. We had been in contact with the broader galaxy for 11 years at that point. 11 years, and in the span of 39 days, we had gone from being an interesting new species of uncertain capability to being the species that the rest of the galaxy had officially been told to approach carefully. My phone rang. It was my mother, calling from Accra. This was becoming a habit. "I saw the advisory," she said. "Yes," I said. "They wrote us up like we're something dangerous," she said. "We are something dangerous," I said. When provoked, she made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something more serious. "Calvin," she said, "do you remember what I always told you when you were small, about how to deal with a bully?" "Yes," I said. "What did I tell you?" "You told me not to look for a fight," I said, "but if someone else brings one to you, make sure they remember it was their idea." "Good," she said, and this time she stayed on the line a little longer before she hung up. The weeks that followed were busy in a different way. Reconstruction teams went to Faro Station. The colony was rebuilt. The school went back first, because someone at the planning level had made that a priority, which I found out about and thought was exactly right. The garden district took longer, because you cannot rush things that grow, but by all accounts it came back better than it had been before, because the second generation of settlers went in knowing what they were building and why. There were memorial services. Francis Doyle was honored at a ceremony in Geneva that I attended. The 41 members of the garrison were remembered by name, every one of them, by Kowalski personally, in a speech that was not long and was not dramatic, and was exactly the kind of speech that should be given for people like that. The galactic feeds, which had been running at extraordinary volume since the first day of the ultimatum, gradually settled into something more normal. The Galactic Council resumed its regular business. New species sent careful, respectful introduction messages to Earth's diplomatic office. Several council members that had previously been absorbed by the Vorthari began requesting formal consultations about their own status, which opened a whole new set of diplomatic work for departments I was not directly part of. The Vorthari themselves went quiet. Not entirely. They still existed, still governed their territories, still sent routine communications through the normal channels, but the specific kind of posture they had maintained for generations, that absolute certainty of dominance, the confidence that the threat was always sufficient, that silence was broken. Something had changed in their calculus, in a way that the council analysts found fascinating and slightly unsettling, because a Vorthari dominion that was uncertain of itself was, in some ways, a less predictable thing than one that was certain. Ambassador Veth sent me a personal message about 3 weeks after the agreement was signed. It was longer than most of Veth's messages. It said, among other things, that the Solari historical record would include a full account of what had happened, with particular attention to the early days, to the decision not to negotiate, and to the specific characteristics of human response that had produced the outcome. Veth said the record would note that humanity's refusal to comply had been, at the time, evaluated by most council members as reckless, and that the council's own assessment had been wrong. Veth also said something at the end of the message that I found I kept returning to. It said, "I do not think your species is fearless. I have spoken with you enough to know that is not it. I think you have learned, through your history, to be afraid and useful at the same time, to be afraid and still decide. That is not something we teach in our diplomatic training. I am not sure it can be taught, but I want you to know that observing it has changed how I think about a great many things." I wrote back to Veth and said that I hoped that was true, and that I hoped other species found the same thing useful. I said that we had not chosen to be the species that demonstrated this. We had simply been the species the Vorthari had chosen to try it on, and we had responded the only way we knew how. Veth said, "Is that how you really see it?" I thought about that for a while. I thought about Kowalski reading the first ultimatum in her office and ordering coffee an hour later. I thought about Admiral Tillman saying 4 words and an entire planetary defense network executing something it had spent 41 days building. I thought about Francis Doyle, steady and clear on the channel for 6 hours, and the Garden District at Faro Station, and my mother's soup that I still cannot replicate, and Laura Finch's story about the kid who said no on the playground. I wrote back to Veth and said, "Yes, that is how we see it. Someone decided to find out what would happen when they pushed us. Now they know." Veth's reply was the longest silence I ever received from them. 31 seconds. The algorithm flagged it as something the Solari use when they are recording a thought they want to be careful about. Then Veth said, "I think the galaxy needed to know. I am glad it was you who showed them, and not someone who would have shown them something worse." I sat at my station for a while after that, watching the feeds. The Galactic Council advisory was still pinned at the top of the public network, updated now with the full account of what had happened, available to any species that wanted to read it. A warning, yes, but also a record. Do not provoke. Do not threaten. Do not mistake patience for weakness. I refilled my coffee, which was still bad, and got back to work. There was a lot of it left to do.